Imagine a general who saves an empire only to stab it in the back. Not once, but repeatedly. Illus was that man. His betrayals didn't just shake the Eastern Roman Empire, they redefined its very future, shaping the Leonid dynasty through a constant dance of civil war and political backstabbing. Was he a hero or a villain? The truth is far more complex and controversial than you think. Illus and Armatus, the treacherous generals who shaped the Leonid dynasty's fate. The orthodox story of the late 5th century Eastern Roman Empire often reads like a morality play. Good emperors besieged by bad men, barbarian generals bought and sold. A court of eunuchs and empresses whispering in velvet corridors while armies decide the truth outside the walls. In that familiar telling, Illus becomes the cautionary example, an Isaurian warlord elevated by imperial favor who repays the gift with rebellion. Armatus, by contrast, is sometimes reduced to a footnote, a glamorous relative of a usurper who betrays his own kin, then receives the predictable reward of an unmarked death. Yet this is not merely a story about character, it is a story about what loyalty meant when the empire's real currency was not rhetoric or law, but garrisons, fortresses, treasuries, and tax. Welcome to the Epic History Tales channel. Subscribe to the channel if you want to watch the similar video streams. In the Leonid world, the dynasty founded by Leo won far and inherited, in a fragile way, by his Isaurian son-in-law Zeno, the empire survived by hiring its own potential gravediggers. Illus and Armatus did not simply betray emperors, they revealed the terms on which emperors ruled. In the first light of this era, Leo I appears as the deliberate architect of a new balance. He had come to the throne as a soldier emperor, but he did not intend to be ruled by soldiers. The Western Empire was collapsing into warlordism. The East, richer and more administratively intact, faced a different danger: the slow privatization of imperial power by men who could command armed force. Leo's answer was to play forces against one another, Germanic officers against Isaurians, palace power against field armies, always searching for a lever that could move the military without surrendering the state. Illus rises out of that machinery. His origins lay in Isauria, the rugged uplands of southern Anatolia, Roman soil, Roman subjects, and yet, in elite Constantinopolitan imagination, something uncomfortably close to the barbarian frontier. Isaurians had a reputation for hard fighting and hard bargaining. Illus learned quickly what the court prized and what it feared. Under Leo I-5, he distinguished himself not as a mere raider, but as a disciplined commander who could be placed where the empire was thin and still hold. Tactical competence mattered, but what mattered more was what competence delivered: control. Border regions were not abstract lines on a map. They were networks of passes, roads, and fortified points, keys that opened or closed the movement of armies. A general who gained the confidence of the emperor could be entrusted with garrisons that, in modern terms, resembled the infrastructure of major military bases. Their walls, stores, workshops, pay chests, and communications were the empire's hardware of coercion, assets whose equivalents today would be valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. When Illus secured such posts, he did not merely earn honor, he acquired leverage. This is the first reframing. The conventional story treats Illus's early successes as service to the state. Another view, not incompatible but sharper, sees them as the first stage in converting imperial resources into personal bargaining power. The empire gave him command to stabilize the frontier. The command, in practice, created a private instrument within the public structure, an armed body that obeyed a man before it obeyed an office. Then the empire convulsed. The crisis came with the usurpation of Basiliscus. The interregnum after Leo I's death had already exposed how fragile the Leonid settlement was. Leo II, the child emperor, died quickly, leaving Zeno, an Isaurian outsider, married into the dynasty, holding a throne that many in the capital had never learned to accept. Basiliscus, brother of the Empress Dowager Verina, seized the moment. What followed was not a clean coup, but a brutal scramble in which the true sovereign seemed to be whoever could keep the army fed, paid, and moving. Armatus enters here like a figure from a different genre. Basiliscus's nephew, a man later sources portray as vain and theatrically self-assured, made commander in the field and entrusted with decisive force. In the usurper's camp were all the ingredients of a new regime, a dynastic claim, palace support through Verena, and an officer corps hungry for advancement. If one reads only the surface, Basiliscus's fall looks like a straightforward failure of legitimacy, doctrine, policy, or popular support. But legitimacy does not move cavalry. Illus watched the upheaval with a professional's eye. Usurpations were not just political declarations, they were audits of who held the empire's usable power. In that chaos, Illus found his opening. He defected calculatedly to Zeno, bringing seasoned Isaurian troops at a moment when Zeno's cause needed not speeches, but shock. This defection was decisive not because it proved Illus's love for lawful emperors, but because it altered the balance of hard force. When experienced units shift sides, the future shifts with them. The reward structure tells its own story. Illus did not merely receive thanks. He gained land grants and confiscated estates, thousands of acres transferred as if imperial territory were coin. In today's terms, given agricultural yield, strategic placement, and sheer scale, such grants would translate into assets worth billions in real estate value. The empire was paying in a form that made him harder to remove. A general with land has food, tenants, local influence, and a safe distance from the palace's immediate reach. Armadas, too, would learn the meaning of reward structures. When Basiliscus faltered, it was Armadas who negotiated with Zeno's side. The sources differ on the exact terms. Whether Zeno promised him high rank and security for his son, perhaps even elevation to Caesar, whether the bargain was later regretted or cynically broken. What is clearer is the logic. Armadas did not abandon Basiliscus because of a sudden epiphany. He abandoned him because he calculated that Basiliscus could no longer pay the political price of obedience. In the pivotal fighting around Nicomedia, Illus delivered what the restored regime required: a crushing blow that broke Basiliscus's forces and made Zeno's return not a plea but a fact. Nicomedia was more than a battlefield. It was a hinge between Asia and the capital, a corridor where armies decided whether Constantinople would be besieged or welcomed. With Basiliscus collapsing, Zeno reclaimed the diadem. Illus emerged from the smoke not as a mere general, but as a man whose hands were on the empire's vault. Titles and court offices followed. Influence congealed into something close to authority. Control over imperial treasuries meant control over gold and silver stores, a proximity to the state's financial heart that, by analogy, resembles managing a national reserve, an apparatus whose modern equivalent could be imagined in the scale of several $trillion. It was not that Illus literally owned this wealth, but that his position allowed him to decide day by day how force would be funded and where it would be pointed. Armadas, for his part, discovered what it meant to be useful after the moment of usefulness had passed. The same regime that needed his betrayal could not easily tolerate what his betrayal implied, that the throne's enemies were not outside the empire but within its command structure. Armatas's later fate, killed after receiving assurances, in accounts that vary on details and agents, became a warning written in blood. Some traditions place Illus near the machinery of this elimination, others leave the responsibility with Zeno or other commanders. The uncertainty itself is revealing. In a court where violence was policy, blame becomes as negotiable as titles. Zeno had been restored by men who had already demonstrated that restoration was transactional. The empire's unlikely saviors had taught it a new lesson. Loyalty had a price, and the price was rising. Power in such a world was not the crown. Power was the ability to make the crown unnecessary. Illus's influence continued to expand. He commanded not only troops in the field, but also forces close to the emperor, units akin to an imperial bodyguard, the armed punctuation of court decisions. He held political sway that reached into the provinces where revenue was gathered and where governors could be coerced or protected. Control over key provinces meant more than prestige, it meant tax income. The annual flow of such revenue, translated into modern fiscal terms, would resemble tens of billions of dollars, an immense, tangible stream that could pay soldiers, fund allies, and starve rivals. And this is where the seeds of discontent took root. The conventional view presents Zeno's suspicion as paranoia or ethnic prejudice, an Isaurian emperor distrusting an Isaurian general because both knew the other's capacity for force. But suspicion was not a psychological flaw, it was structural. A ruler who depends on private power invites a private takeover. Zeno had returned to the throne through a coalition that included men who had already proven they could remove a regime when it no longer served them. To fear Illus was to read the recent past accurately. Then came the assassination attempt, brazen enough to transform court tension into personal vendetta. Illus survived, but survival altered the temperature of every relationship. Whether the attempt was engineered by rivals, whispered into motion by imperial circles, or linked to the Empress Ariadne's alleged hostility, sources do not agree, and later writers have their own agendas. Its effect is less disputed than its authorship. It convinced Illus that his position, however mighty, was not secure within Zeno's orbit. From that moment, loyalty becomes less a virtue than a strategy under review. Illus responded by fortifying. He secured private holdings, purchased land, and built strongholds, assets not merely symbolic but practical. In modern terms, investing in defensible estates and private security infrastructure at this scale evokes hundreds of millions of dollars. It was, in essence, insurance against imperial volatility. The empire's official security could not be trusted if the emperor himself might be the source of danger. Here, Armatus reappears as a ghost in the political imagination. His death, whatever its exact mechanics, stood as precedent. A man could defect to save an emperor and still be eliminated once peace returned. In such an environment, building a private refuge is not necessarily rebellion, it is prudence. Illus then made the alliance that would stain his name forever. He joined with Verina, the Empress Dowager, ambitious, embittered, and politically experienced. Verina had helped bring down Zeno once. Her hatred, or at least her willingness to conspire, had survived her defeat. To ally with her was to take hold of dynastic legitimacy like a weapon. Verina carried the Leonid aura. Sister of Basiliscus, widow of Leo I, mother of Ariadne, her presence could sanctify a revolt as something more than a military mutiny. But she also brought wealth and networks, hordes of precious metals, jewels, and patronage ties accumulated in the palace world. Combined with Illus's own resources, such wealth converted into modern terms could be imagined in the hundreds of millions, perhaps even billions. In a state where armies expected donatives and cities expected relief, money was political speech. The alliance was dangerous not only because it threatened Zeno, but because it made a rival center of legitimacy financially credible. The empire now contained two gravitational fields, the emperor's court and Illus's growing constellation of soldiers, estates, and allies. Between them lay the fragile body of the state, still bleeding from usurpation and restoration. A crisis was inevitable. The only question was its form. Marcian's rebellion provided the first test. Marcian, of imperial connections and high ambition, represented a different kind of threat, not a frontier general rising on his own strength, but a figure who could plausibly claim the throne through lineage and court support. In the usual telling, Illus appears as the loyal enforcer who suppresses the revolt. That is not wrong, it is incomplete. Illus played a double game. He manipulated the rebellion with a cold calculation, feeding the rebel cause with intelligence and resources enough to let it grow dangerous, not enough to let it win, while positioning himself to turn at the moment that would yield maximum advantage. Such a posture is difficult to prove in a modern judicial sense. The sources are partial, shaped by hostility or justification. Yet the pattern fits the incentives. A rebellion that rises and falls at a general's convenience can be turned into a mechanism for purging rivals and proving indispensability. In modern analogy, the value of such positioning is not merely territorial. It resembles control of an elite intelligence network, something like owning a top-tier cybersecurity firm and its data. The ability to know what others plan before they act, and to make oneself the necessary gatekeeper of safety. That strategic value is difficult to price, but its consequences can reach into the untold billions. Marcian was captured swiftly, the suppression framed as Illus's precision and loyalty, and the rewards followed again. Consolidation of power within the court, access to estates and military assets seized from the defeated. Marcian's properties, agricultural lands, and urban holdings would translate in modern terms into hundreds of millions of dollars. The captured military assets, siege engines, arms, equipment would be tens of millions more. The imperial state called this confiscation justice. Illus experienced it as accumulation. Each revolt suppressed made Illus more essential. Each reward made him more dangerous. Zeno's trust eroded into something more brittle than hatred, fear mixed with dependence. The emperor could not easily strike Illus down without risking another civil war. He could not easily tolerate him without risking eventual overthrow. That was the Leonid predicament in its starkest form. The dynasty had relied on strongmen to survive, and those strongmen had learned that survival was negotiable. By now, Illus possessed what emperors feared most: a private army large enough to matter. In modern terms, maintaining such a force, pay, provisions, equipment, incentives would incur annual operational costs in the hundreds of millions, and he possessed wealth in portable form, gold and silver reserves that might be estimated, by cautious analogy, as exceeding $1 billion. In the political economy of the 5th century, this meant he could purchase time, loyalty, and movement, the basic ingredients of regime change. Armatus's earlier arc casts a long shadow here. He too had risen by betrayal. He too had been rewarded, and he had been removed. If Armatus was the cautionary tale about the throne's gratitude, Illus was the lesson learned. Never place one's life entirely inside the emperor's promise. That lesson would soon be tested in the open. The decisive break came with the proclamation of Leontius as emperor. Here, the story usually hardens into condemnation. Illus, unable to restrain his ambition, turns traitor and sets the empire aflame. But even this ultimate betrayal can be understood differently depending on the definition of treason. If treason is betrayal of the state, Illus was guilty. If treason is betrayal of a personal bond to the emperor, the question becomes more complex in a court where attempted assassinations, broken promises, and ritualized purges were instruments of policy. Illus may have regarded himself not as a destroyer of order, but as a man refusing to die like Armatus, useful until inconvenient. Leontius gave the revolt a face that Illus himself could not easily provide. Whether Leontius was a puppet or a partner is debated in tone if not in outcome. Illus needed a figure who could wear the purple without immediately provoking every faction against an Isaurian usurper. A new emperor could attract defectors who would never rally to Illus personally. In that sense, Leontius was not merely a claimant. He was a political technology. The proclamation ignited full-scale civil war. The empire's internal conflict became cataclysmic precisely because it was not an invasion from beyond the frontier, but an implosion within the administrative body. Illus and his allies seized provincial capitals and their treasuries. Such seizures produced immediate liquid wealth, millions at once in coin and valuables, and more importantly, access to ongoing tax receipts. Translated into modern terms, the combined annual value could reach into the hundreds of millions. Civil war in late Rome was financed by capturing the machinery of taxation. The 4-year conflict that followed became a contest not only of armies, but of endurance. Illus proved again that he understood war as a system. He maneuvered, outpaced, and at times outwitted Zeno's forces. He drew on local resources, tried to lock down passes and strong points, and attempted to make geography his ally. Control of land meant control of food, control of mines meant metal for coin, control of roads meant messages and supply. In modern valuation, the acquisition of productive territory, fertile plains, resource sites, trade choke points resembles the capture of multiple billions of dollars in assets. That language is anachronistic in detail, but accurate in principle. The revolt was not funded by ideas, it was funded by the conversion of imperial productivity into rebel solvency. And yet the deeper cost was paid by the empire itself. Prolonged civil war bled the treasury. Garrisons on the borders went undermanned or unpaid. Fortifications decayed. Soldiers who should have been facing external threats were marched against fellow Romans. The Eastern Roman Empire, which survived the 5th century partly because it preserved its fiscal apparatus, risked destroying that apparatus from within. Illus, conversely, amassed personal wealth through plunder and control of trade routes, wealth that later tradition, with varying degrees of exaggeration, imagines as enormous. Even conservative interpretation allows this. A commander who holds cities and roads during civil war becomes the toll gate of commerce. In modern analogy, the tangible gains could plausibly exceed $1 billion in value, but every such gain was a subtraction from imperial stability. Here, the overlooked factor reshapes the interpretation. The usual focus on treason and character obscures the transformation of the empire into something like a marketplace of coercion. Civil wars were not simply political crises, they were redistribution events. Each rebellion shifted land, gold offices, and armed men from one patronage network to another. The Leonid dynasty's fate was shaped less by ideology than by the repeated auctioning of the state's assets to whoever could most credibly threaten violence. Illus and Armatus, different in origin, style, and reputation, belonged to the same structural moment. Both learned that the throne was not a moral center, but a node in a network of force. Both treated allegiance as a contract. Armatus had gambled and lost. Illus gambled longer. The end came at Papurius, where Illus made his final stand behind stone and mountain. The siege was protracted, grim, and deeply symbolic. A man who had moved emperors like pieces was now pinned in place, reduced to waiting for hunger and betrayal to do what armies could not. Fortresses, once the source of his leverage, became his cage. When Papurius fell, Illus was captured and executed. The swiftness of his death speaks to the regime's anxiety. A man like Illus could not be safely paraded or imprisoned. He had too many connections, too much remembered influence. His wealth and land, his immense accumulation, were confiscated by the state. If his fortune had reached the scale later writers imply, then the loss was total, billions in modern terms, erased in a moment. The risk that Illus had managed for years finally matured into its full cost. The futility, however, is not simple. His rebellions failed, but the empire that survived did not return unchanged. The consequences reverberated through the Leonid dynasty, destabilizing succession and deepening a culture of suspicion. Even after Zeno outlasted the revolt, the court had learned habits that could not easily be unlearned. Preemptive distrust, reliance on informers, and the willingness to settle political questions through elimination rather than integration. Financially and territorially, the toll was immense. The treasury that Illus had once helped secure and fill through restoration now stood depleted. A deficit, translated into modern governmental terms, could be imagined as hundreds of billions in debt. An analogy meant not as precise accounting, but as a way to grasp scale. The empire had spent years burning its own revenue base to defeat a man who had once been among its most effective protectors. Armatus's legacy, though shorter, fits into this same pattern. His betrayal of Basiliscus helped restore Zeno. His death taught generals that imperial promises could be revoked. Together, the arcs of Armatus and Illus formed a single lesson that outlived them. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the most dangerous weapon was not a sword, but a precedent. Once established, it shaped every negotiation between throne and army. Illus remains a complex and polarizing figure because he embodies the empire's contradiction. His military prowess saved the regime in moments when it might have collapsed. His opportunistic betrayals scarred it when it most needed cohesion. Some interpretations see him as a villain whose ambition nearly shattered the state. Others, more structural, see him as a symptom, an intelligent actor responding to a system that rewarded private power and punished trust. The sources themselves, filtered through court histories and moralizing chronicles, rarely allow a clean verdict. They offer portraits painted in the pigments of faction. What can be said with greater confidence is the scale of what was lost in the cycle of treason and counter-treason, productivity disrupted, infrastructure damaged, armies misdirected, opportunities consumed by internal war. In modern economic terms, the total cost, lost output, ruined cities, diverted resources would reach into the trillions, but even that language, however dramatic, only approximates the deeper loss, the erosion of the assumption that the empire was a shared enterprise rather than a prize. When Illus's head fell and his estates reverted to the state, the Leonid dynasty did not simply win. It survived another round in a recurring contest over what the empire was. Was it the emperor's household defended by personal loyalty? Was it a legal order maintained by offices and norms? Or was it, increasingly, a reservoir of assets, fortresses, treasuries, tax provinces contested by those strong enough to seize and hold them? Illus and Armatus did not invent that contest. They revealed it, and in doing so they shaped the fate of the Leonid world more profoundly than a dozen ceremonial coronations. Their treachery was not an interruption of history's flow. It was the current itself carrying the empire toward a future, in which survival depended not only on defeating enemies at the border, but on preventing the state from being turned, piece by piece, into the property of its protectors.